5 important abiotic factors of an Arctic tundra are cold climate, long winters, short summers, vegetation, and permafrost. How do these abiotic factors influence the organisms that live in an Arctic tundra? Cold climate and long winters. How does cold climate and long winters affect the organisms that lives in an Arctic tundra? The animals that live in this extreme environment have adapted to living through an average of negative 34 degrees Fahrenheit, harsh and cold winters. Some animals benefit from the wintertime, but some do not. An example would be polar bears. Cold climate affects polar bears in a good way, because this means that there is frozen ice, and that means they can go on the sea ice where they can hunt seal to survive. They are active during the winter. In the wintertime, when the climate is the coldest, some animals are hibernating due to the lack of food available to them during the winter. But this also means they can gain energy and decrease energy loss. For birds, to avoid the lack of food and freezing temperature, they emigrate and migrate to a warmer place instead. This also applies to other species that live in the Arctic tundra in the summer. When some animals are hibernating, more food are available for the other animals during winter. The cold climate affects the population of the animals that live in the Arctic tundra, since a few animals like birds are emigrating and reptiles and amphibians decreases because they cannot adapt to the cold climate. In the winter, the plants are alive but not actively growing, just like when animals are hibernating. Permafrost. How does permafrost affect the organisms that live in an Arctic tundra? Permafrost plays an important role in the Arctic since most of it is the foundation of the region's ecosystem. Permafrost is a layer of dead plants and soil at or below 0 degrees Celsius or 32 degrees Fahrenheit freezing point of water that has been frozen for more than 2 years and is permanently frozen. The surface layer is called active layer, and this thaws in the summertime, and it forms bogs, swallow lakes, and ponds. Due to this change, insects would swarm around the water and large number of birds would eat them, which means that it is an invitation of explosion of animal life. It impacts the variety of food available for animals. Permafrost makes nutrient-rich soil that lets a large number and different kinds of vegetation to grow and reproduce. Plant life is protected from the permafrost when shrub fires occasionally happen during the seasons that are dry. Permafrost do not allow the growing of most vegetation that only has deep root systems such as trees due to the fact that most of the ground is frozen. If permafrost did not exist, the whole ecosystem and the way animals live would not be the same. It would change the entire system and food chain because vegetation would not exist and there would be not as much variety in food. Short summers and vegetation. How does the short summers affect the organisms that live in an Arctic tundra? The short summer season only exists for about 50 to 60 days, and the average temperature is from 3 degrees to 12 degrees, which is a temperature hot enough for animals to reproduce and plants to grow. The top level of soil that is on top of the permafrost thaws in the summer, and it is a time period that is good enough for plants to grow. When this occurs, the plants are provided with moist due to the ponds and bogs that are formed. Small life are also formed. This benefits the animals that hibernate in the winter because this means they have more food that are available to them. Examples. In the summer, food are available to siksik. They feed on tundra plants, seeds, and fruit. They then have more than enough fat in their body to last them throughout the long winter season, just like most animals that hibernate in the winter. The peregrine falcon flies around the tundra to hunt for food, like small birds, lemmings, and voles, since this opportunity only exists for them in the summer. The short summer season allows most animals in this ecosystem to survive because they gain enough body fat for the winter. 7 organisms that interact with one another are plants, lemmings, Arctic hare, ermine, Arctic foxes, Arctic wolves, and polar bears. Here are the different types of trophic levels in an Arctic tundra. The Arctic tundra's producers are plants such as Arctic willow and pasque-flower. Plants are producers because it is an organism that performs photosynthesis and it can provide its own food. Some of their energy is lost due to heat, some of it is stored for themselves, but they can make their own energy too. Lemmings and Arctic hare are primary consumers because they only eat plants, which are producers. Secondary consumers are organisms that only eat meat, or eat plants and also other animals. Secondary consumers cannot be herbivores. They would only have to eat meat and not just plants. A secondary consumer eats a primary consumer that lives off a plant, just like ermine and Arctic foxes. Tertiary consumers are omnivores or carnivores. They can eat an omnivore who feeds on both animals and plants or only eat meat. To be able to be considered as a tertiary consumer, the animal has to eat an animal who eats an animal that eats a plant. An example would be an Arctic wolf who eats an Arctic fox that ate a hare that ate a plant. Tertiary consumers are animals who eat secondary consumers. This would be an example of the Arctic wolf and a polar bear. How do 7 organisms interact? Plants are the producers, and they are eaten by the lemmings and Arctic hares. This makes the lemmings and Arctic hares the primary consumers, and the lemmings and Arctic hares also compete. The ermine and Arctic fox then eat the lemmings or Arctic hare. The ermine and Arctic fox compete, and this also makes them the secondary consumers. The Arctic wolves and polar bears eat ermine or Arctic fox, and they compete. This makes them the tertiary consumers. Compete is when different members of species compete for resources.
Is it done? Yeah. Okay, give me my iPad.